So Alex, it'd be awesome to get started with a little bit of your personal journey into the world of veganism. What's kind of brought you here?
So I actually stopped eating meat from cartoon movies when I was a child. There was a movie Charlotte's Web. I saw it when I was about 4, and I stopped eating meat immediately. Yeah, it was. If you've ever seen Charlotte's Web, it's tragic. And so I kind of freaked out a bit. I asked my parents to explain it a bit more, and they explained that's how you get animals. That's how they produce meat and hamburgers and chicken, that it comes from animals from farms, etc. That was it for me. So I haven't had meat since I was 4, and that was 28 years ago. Fish came very shortly thereafter. I watched The Little Mermaid. There's a scene in The Little Mermaid where Sebastian is just running around the kitchen while like a chef chases him with a knife. Whew. And that was about it. So I haven't had meat or seafood since I was 4 or 5 from cartoon movies. And I didn't go fully vegan until probably my late teens, early 20s, because even up until that time I had a misconception about dairy. And I avoided dairy when I could, so I never ate eggs, I never drank milk or anything like that, but I would cheat and have a slice of cake from time to time. So I was predominantly vegan until my 20s, but I was plant-based. I shouldn't say vegan because I really wasn't fully committed to not having animal byproducts. And then I educated myself a bit more when I hit my 20s about the reality of dairy. I don't know how things are in the UK, but especially in the US, it's very ingrained in us, in our schooling, that dairy is very, very important for you and that it's incredibly healthy for you. At no point are you ever taught that it's food for a baby cow and that baby is taken from their mother and you are stealing that milk. This is nothing part of our learning process. And there was also a huge ad campaign here. Athletes, celebrities, models, the Got Milk campaign. I'm sure there was something similar over there with different, celebrities that were relevant in that country. And so it really wasn't until my late 20s that I fully understood that I shouldn't even be like cheating from time to time and how morally apprehensible I found the entire situation. And then in my early 20s, maybe for the last 10 years, I got involved in animal rights activism. And I've been super strict ever since.
I'm amazed at the level of empathy of a 4-year-old watching a Disney film.
I'm surprised. It forever surprises me that more people don't go vegetarian or vegan or plant-based from cartoon movies as children. There's Dumbo, which shows the exploitation at zoos. And there is, The Fox and the Hound, which is a heartbreaking look at hunting. And Bambi, which also was a heartbreaking look at hunting. And I always watched these movies and was really horrified, and I would cry afterwards. I didn't find them to be joyful, particularly. And my parents didn't push me. I think to an extent they probably assumed it was a phase, but they indulged me. And so I think that was also a big part of it too, is that I was very unnerved by it, and my parents didn't try to force me to consume it anyway. They just started cooking 2 meals for me and working around it.
Wow. Did they do you think they picked up any of it at the time, or did they kind of think, like you said, they thought it was a phase, but did they kind of pick up any of that empathy, or maybe some of the other arguments, the health, the environment, anything else come from it?
My mother was a bit more amenable to it. She had been a vegetarian for most of her life. So I think when she started cooking kind of that separate meal for me, she started eating that a little bit more. Of course, I wish that they had jumped on board with me for empathy reasons. But it was more of if she feels that way, we'll allow her to feel that way.
Yeah. And how about, you mentioned that dairy was deeply ingrained in the sort of standard American diet. It's certainly the similar over here. I remember as a child, it was a great privilege to be the milk monitor in primary school. So that meant that you got to carry the tray of milk over to the kids for the morning snack, and everyone got to have their milk. And I also remember there being a couple of kids who were lactose intolerant, or just people, and not baby cows, whichever you want to call it. But there was lactose intolerance kids, and they were always treated a bit oddly. So You know, they were always kind of a bit weird. So you know, you mentioned there about the Got Milk campaign, so on. It definitely resonates, and I think that still goes on in mainstream culture. You know, in the UK now, I'm sure it does in the US. Like, I appreciate this wasn't a leap that you'd necessarily taken, but you were still. You'd still taken the leap of not eating meat and so on, and that's so intrinsic into kind of particularly US and UK culture. You know, what was school life like being the kid who didn't eat meat?
Interesting. I even at that time, like, I wouldn't drink milk, so I would say I was lactose intolerant sometimes just to get around it. But even then, I wouldn't drink milk or eat an omelet or anything like that. So I was still pretty strict. It was interesting. Kids would often try to sneak meat into my meals, like when I wasn't looking. Teachers at some point had approached my parents and said, you know, it isn't healthy that, you know, you're allowing her to not eat meat.
Wow.
And so people had actually approached my parents, you know, telling them that they were not doing what was best for me by allowing me to not eat baby cow food and, you know, rotting animal carcasses, essentially, which as an adult, I look back and I'm just like, how absurd. But my parents stuck to their guns on it. I was very lucky. But it was interesting because I never even met another vegetarian until I was probably like my last year of high school or in college. It was a different time. You know, now I have tons of friends who are vegan, plant-based, you know, vegetarian, all the other tarians and ways that people identify. But back then it was just very, very strange that I did not eat meat or cheese, or when I would go, like, I always had to pack separate food. I never had a school lunch in my life. Even when I would go to parties, my mom would send me with my own food, which everyone thought was so crazy, which nowadays that's so normal. Like, you know, who has, you know, gluten intolerances and all these things. So it's very normalized now to kind of tailor your life to your dietary restrictions. But back in 1995, it was not. I would take like cheese off of my pizza at pizza parties and just eat like the bread with the tomato sauce on it. Everyone looked at me like I was tragically bizarre. But what's wonderful now is that there's actually Meatless Mondays in New York City schools.
Wow.
So it's done such a complete, there's been such a complete shift from the time that I was in elementary school and junior high and high school till now, where now they're encouraging children to eat plant-based, and there's, you know, Meatless Mondays and things like that.
Tell us a little bit about, you know, how you got from there, and then, you know, obviously taking the leap to veganism, and then ultimately to the place where you thought, actually, my personal veganism isn't enough, almost. Like, I need to take a step further into the world of activism. I need to do something. You know, what was that journey like? I
think a lot of it also had to do with movies that you watch. I think you often watch movies and we're always drawn to particular characters that see something that's wrong and then they do something about it. And we admire that in a sense. But when it comes to our daily lives, we think that like our own actions are enough, but we don't take that extra step to really put our money where our mouth is, so to speak. Yeah. I suppose that's the best expression I can really think for it. And I went to my first PETA protest for fur right when I got into college. I went to one and I realized this is a way where my personal choices, yeah, it helps, of course. And I know that every little bit helps and it lessens demand, etc. But I figured if I have the stomach for it and I feel comfortable going out there and doing these things, then I really should be taking advantage of the fact that I have the opportunity to do more. And then I eventually got involved with the Save movement, going to vigils at slaughterhouses. I went to my first one and I realized that if I had the stomach for it, which they're not for everybody, going to live markets and slaughterhouses for vigils, but I realized that if I had the capacity to do it, that it was important that I should to get that footage out there. And it's one of those things where you kind of, once you go to these things once, you realize like, okay, like I'm going to do this forever. So it wasn't like a long journey to get there. It was just once I went to one protest, I was like, okay, this is part of your life now. We have to keep looking out for more protests. And once I went to a vigil, it was like, okay, we're going to come every 2 weeks, Thursday morning. And this is part of, you know, your routine now.
You mentioned it's not for everyone, and I've heard lots of people say similar things, that that they are, whilst they might participate and they get involved, they're also kind of very conscious that psychologically it's not for everyone. It'd be good to hear a little bit more about that, how you perhaps have overcome that. I appreciate everybody's got their personal stories, but how you personally found the stomach for it, if you like, because I imagine the first time you did it, I can't imagine that it would have just come to you, and you'd have been fine. Like I'd imagine they would have left a mark. So it'd be good to understand a little bit about your journey from the psychological standpoint.
Yeah, the first vigil I went to was it was pretty intense. We had been to there was a slaughterhouse market, and it's right in a residential area. And we had gone there and we had seen a truck that came in. It was very eye-opening, just seeing the animals in person, the condition that they were in, and they get pulled in. And then at a certain point in time, everybody had to leave, and I decided to stick around for another 10 minutes because we heard that there might be another shipment coming. And the truck actually was pulled around the block, and I approached the truck driver. I asked if I could spend some time with the animals, and he let me. So I was by myself, really, was my first real interaction. Everybody else had left. So it was just me and a truckload of sheep and baby goats. I cried a lot that time. I've since become, I hate to say it, but I've become very numb to it to a certain extent, and I don't cry as much now, and I kind of just learned to deal with it, unfortunately. But the first time it was pretty brutal. There were a lot of babies on the truck in particular, and knowing that you actually can't do anything to stop what's going to happen. So the inevitable is happening. It's going to happen within the next hour. You're here. There's just this, still barrier between the two of you, between you and the animals, and there's nothing you can do. And I think that's the worst part, is seeing their suffering, but not having the power, unfortunately, because of laws and regulations, to stop the horror that is happening. So that was particularly brutal, especially because at that slaughterhouse, the kill floor is right up against the street. So you can actually hear the animals banging up against the wall, and you can hear them crying as it happens. So there's really it was an interesting setup because it wasn't an industrial slaughterhouse. It was somewhere where I could be on a public street and I'm right up against the wall where there's a kill floor, and you can hear it. So that was, the first time was particularly rough for me. Cried a lot when I got home, but at the very least I was able to document that they existed and that they went through it. So you feel very helpless at first, which is a natural instinct because you don't have the power to stop it. But I found a little bit of solace in the fact that at the very least I was able to give them water. I sing lullabies to them to try to just calm them down or soothe them a little bit, pet them. I document it, photos and videos, to try to get it out there so at least their stories get told. But with that being said, I was surprised at the tolerance I had for it, because at no point did I think I can't go back or I can never do that again. My first thought was, when is there another vigil? But it isn't for everybody. And I think that I recognize that everybody has their own strengths. Everyone has their own tolerance levels. Everyone also has their own background of trauma. So I personally don't have a traumatic background. I've never had any physical abuse. I've never had any mental abuse or anything like that. So I wasn't triggered in any way. I was lucky enough to not have that in my life. But for somebody who has lived in those, has had experiences like that, this could be incredibly damaging potentially to their, to their mental health. And so I think I just recognize that if I had the capacity for it, then I should continue with it.
Yeah, no, I completely understand. And more power to you, because those are, incredibly traumatic experiences, and you documenting, like you say, that those lives existed, and getting that story told and out there, I think is, incredibly important. On that note, was there, I imagine And what year specifically was this? Were we in an era of social media by this point? At what point did you start almost feeling the effect of being able to post that footage somewhere and almost feel an instant reaction back? Was that at the very beginning, or did this kind of social media bit come slightly later?
This was already in the age of Instagram at this point, and so I immediately uploaded things to Instagram that day. And by the end of the day, I had 40 DMs back of like, this is horrible. Like, people who are vegan and plant-based, obviously have a natural inclination to like reach out to you when you post stuff like that. Like, how are you? This is heartbreaking. But it was also, I was surprised at how many people in my life who are like diehard carnivores who have always like given me, a lot of flack for being vegan, reached out like, oh, or like, that made me cry, or I haven't been able to like, I wasn't able to eat my lunch today. And so I was able to see this like immediate reaction, which I also think was probably part of the reason too why I decided like, okay, this is for me, like I'm going to keep doing it. Because with the age of social media, there really was this like instantaneous reaction, and it was able to get out there so quickly.
Yeah, I guess that's it'd be good to get your view on this. Do you think that's kind of accelerated the save movement, the activist movement in the world of veganism, and generally speaking, have you had positive experiences off the back of that acceleration, or have you also found in this world of polarization that actually it's also come with almost a secondary trauma in the you put yourself out there and you're going to get a lot of heat back? What's your experience been like that in that world?
Definitely a mix of both. There's certainly people who see it and they are horrified by what they see, and they take that step, not that step, but they take that second to kind of like, oh, like, what did I just see? Yeah. And they're very, I wouldn't want to say that they're thrilled by what you've shown them, but at least they are inquisitive or curious. And then there's so much support too from like the vegan and plant-based community here, especially in New York and New Jersey. So on that aspect, it's really good because you have everyone in the community that like kind of rallies around you, and a lot of people have positive feedback to it. With that being said, not everybody is thrilled that I post. Not everyone is thrilled that I post that. A lot of my messages on Instagram, my DMs are very, very interesting. There's some people who say, it's wonderful that you would go and, get that footage out there. And then there are just people who send you just long, paragraphs going in on you, a lot of like threats.
Wow.
So a mixed bag.
Wow. Was that a bit of a shock to you? Or were you kind of, you kind of prepared for it? Yeah.
I, as someone who hasn't had meat since they were 4 and has always been very vocal about it.
Right.
So even when I was at like birthday party, like a 10th birthday party, I was like, that's mean. That was a dead animal. So I've always been, pretty vocal about it, and it's always had a mixed reaction. So I very much anticipated once I started putting it on social media, it would be the same thing.
Yeah. Did you have to develop a different level of resilience? Because I'd imagine like, I'm just thinking back, when you're 10, it's difficult enough, like at a party, being any form of difference as a kid growing up, as we all know, is set upon by the group. Kids can be mean, and that's one aspect. But social media is like that on steroids sort of thing. It can be that tenfold, and people particularly probably even worse because they're hiding behind distance, a Wi-Fi connection, and their screen. So was there another level of resilience, even though you like you say, you'd been sort of training yourself since 4 years old, really, in I'm going to be an activist and I'm going to have my voice heard. But was there a different level of resilience that you had to develop, with it being kind of coming in unfiltered into your kind of home, into your direct space in front of you on your phone?
I think for the most part, I'm not tragically impressed by cowardice, which is usually what, the keyboard warriors are who send me those messages. So I think I try to keep that attitude about it. I think a little bit more in the beginning, I was probably a little bit more taken back by like the level of like the violent threats I would receive. So I think at first it was just like you're a bit taken back by it. But it was something I like very quickly acclimated to and was just like, all right, cool.
It wasn't going to stop you.
No, it didn't particularly bother me so much. I think, again, I expected it. And I had a bit of a tougher tolerance too. I managed a nightclub for 5 years. And I would have just, grown men scream at me on the weekends if they would get, they were thrown out for being excessively drunk, and they would just... So I think that my tolerance just over time...
sadly, was built up. Yeah.
Yeah, so it...
No, I get it totally. But on the positive side, and you mentioned, you sort of alluded to it a little bit, but I imagine you found a bit of a community. Again, thinking about, like you said, there was a long period of time in your upbringing where you hadn't met another vegetarian, let alone, encountered anybody who was vegan, and then to go into this world of activism, saves, bearing witness, pizza protests, etc. Did you find a community, and was that easily found? Were you easily welcomed?
Yeah, I was very pleasantly surprised, actually, how quickly I ended up forming relationships with people years ago that I'm still very close with. It was I remember my first vigil, the organizer of that particular vigil was so nice to me when she saw me walking down the street. She was like, "Are you here for us?" I was like, "Yeah." Like she was so excited that there was like a new person who wanted to come. They introduced me to everybody. We all exchanged numbers immediately. And then since then, I'm a member of a few other organizations like Voters for Animal Rights, the Save Movement as well. And it was interesting. It was kind of an interesting way to go from all of my friends. Everyone eats meat. Everyone's eating everything. And then to be able to go out with people who were like, "Oh no, we're going to go to a vegan restaurant." It was like the heavens opened up. So it was very, it was a relief almost.
Yeah. No, I imagine it would have been, like you say, just the thought of being able to not be the awkward vegan in a group when you're choosing where to go for dinner, like just even that comfort of like, we kind of know where we're gonna, the genre of restaurant isn't up for debate. It will be a vegan restaurant, but which one?
Right, which is something it was always like pulling teeth to try to get, my friends to go to a strictly vegan or vegetarian restaurant. And I have a few of my close friends who from time to time would cave and they would indulge me. But as the rule of thumb, they're going to a sushi restaurant or a steakhouse or this place. And it's like, fantastic. And out of principle, I would always get a separate check. And it was never in the sense of like, I'm nickel and diming and don't want to like just evenly split the bill with anybody. It was more like my own like protest to be like, I'm not helping you pay for that chicken. No, ma'am. So it was nice to just go out to a restaurant and even just like equally split a bill 5 ways if you're with 5 people, because I didn't mind putting money towards whatever everyone had or their appetizers and their drinks. That doesn't bother me. It was just a completely even different dining experience and not having to eat my food across from, an animal that I had just, I remember there was one time I went out from a friend's birthday dinner and I'd gone to a vigil that morning and we had a lot of cows there and they were in really rough condition. Just an awful, awful morning. And then we all went out for my friend's birthday dinner and 2 got hamburgers and 2 got steaks. And so I'm sitting there and like that morning I had been singing lullabies and giving water to them and crying. And now I'm sitting across from people who were eating that animal. And so I would say that finding a community was just more of a relief for me than anything, because it just made simple things like going out for drinks and appetizers so much simpler.
No, I can understand that. And to be honest with you, I'd never really thought about it from that dynamic. But you're absolutely right that there's an extra layer of trauma almost that's brought back every time you then have to interact with the rest of the omnivorous world. The fact that no one cares, that feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like I wonder, like, was this cow sourced from, the live market we were at this morning? Probably not, but there's a possibility. And like that, knowing that would just like it made the entire experience so unappetizing. And it was, as much as you love your friends who are not, vegan and plant-based, and you want to spend time with them and you want to socialize with them, there's such a disconnect that I'm experiencing, and I'm looking at everything from just like such a different lens. So I think it's really important too for people who are even just getting into eating plant-based or trying to go vegan or trying to get more into activism to at least, establish some form of relationship with a few people who have already done it, because it makes it a lot easier.
Yeah. Yeah, 100% it does. Absolutely. There's a point I want to go back to. You mentioned a couple of times in your activism, and I've seen it on your social media profiles, you documenting live markets in New York. And the reason I particularly wanted to draw attention to this and get your viewpoint on it, and I know we talked about it just before we started recording, but is in the last year, obviously there's been a real spotlight on wet markets, and the source of the pandemic has been essentially sort of pinpointed down, outside of some conspiracy theorists, but has been pinpointed down to a wet market in Wuhan and so on. I think people would be surprised to learn, based on the mainstream media narrative, that these markets aren't the exclusive right of China. I'd love to get your view on it, your experience with it, and your perspective on that mainstream narrative.
I was horrified, first and foremost. I was very horrified with the very racist reaction that people have had. And this idea that this is something that only comes from Asia, and this is something that's only done there. And that's just simply not true. Wet markets, live markets, markets like that, they're in every country. This is nothing unique to one, area or region. And I was really disappointed by the way that the media kind of covered it, to say that, like, because they would often refer to it as like the wet markets that you predominantly see in China and parts of Asia, and they kept kind of making it seem like this was something unique to, other countries and continents, and not the United States. And I, even to this day, we've barely seen any media coverage of, okay, so if this is how the pandemic can arise from this type of market, what about the ones that we have here that are just as filthy, just as unregulated? And to pinpoint that on, one country or one, is such a, I honestly don't even know the word for it. It is, I think it's incredibly irresponsible, first and foremost, to constantly feed into that narrative. It's dangerous, and it's simply not true. And I think that it's such a missed opportunity as well, because the entire world is finally aware of, like, okay, animal markets pose a huge risk to public safety. And whether or not, people are interested in, cutting animal consumption out of their lives for health reasons, or if they're doing it for, ethical reasons like I do, I think health is also one aspect that I think everyone can kind of agree on to a certain extent. And, to not acknowledge that almost every country, probably every country, I'm saying almost every country because I don't know for sure, but it's a safe assumption that a predominant amount of countries and continents all over the world have these wet markets, live markets, and even so much so that in, kind of the animal activism community I'm in, we do not even use the term wet market anymore. We simply say live animal market,
Mm.
because unfortunately the media took this term wet market and made it sound so specific
Yeah.
to China, like they don't exist everywhere else, that we try to use the term like live animal market now to show like, no, they're everywhere. And you cannot blame and act like it's so specific to one country when that simply isn't true. And I think I had hoped that a global pandemic caused from eating animals would cause, every country to be a little bit more introspective and say, well, do we have them here? Do we have this? Do we have enough strict regulations? Are they being inspected? Because they probably aren't being inspected that much. Because I've been to some, at least here in New York and New Jersey, I have been to live markets where they're hosing blood and feces into public sewer systems. So, the next pandemic or the next, outbreak, it could very just as easily have come from New Jersey or New York. And I think that it's such a missed opportunity for the world not to be saying like, well, what are we doing in our, specific areas that could also contribute to a global pandemic like this? And I think that the narrative that the media's come up with I think it's been proven how dangerous it is. And I think it's very heartbreaking that, some people are being targeted simply because this narrative has been like that, this market is specific to one country and that this is how this all started. When the reality is, they're everywhere. I've been to live markets. I went to one in New Jersey, and right in front of me, they hosed blood, feces, urine into a public sewer system. They had animals out on a public sidewalk in a residential area, and they were chickens, and they were very, very obviously sick. Mm. There was, pus coming out of their eyes, open sores on orifices everywhere. That poses a huge public safety risk to that area as well. And so I think the one positive thing I think that I've seen out of it is that at least people in my life have become more interested in learning about the live animal markets here.
Yeah.
So like I've had, a few friends, reach out to me and they're like, well, do you think that like anything like this could ever happen? Could ever start from like the places that you go to? And I'm like, absolutely. Of course it could. The regulations, it doesn't matter what country you're in as far as I'm concerned, the regulations are very, very lax, if not essentially non-existent. There really is no regulations. And the industries have also had a very long time of conducting business in a very unregulated way, and they feel very empowered by it because it is allowed to slide. I've gone to live markets where I've had blood and feces thrown at me by the workers, and they're not concerned at all because as far as they're concerned, like, they're allowed to do this.
It's just shocking, really. Your view on the why that mainstream narrative hasn't been adopted? Do you think it's as simple as there's a profit motive there and the kind of the mainstream media is kind of in on that, if you like, that if we start turning the spotlight onto sort of Western animal agriculture, whether it be through a live animal market in New York or any other aspect of factory farming, etc., then the whole sort of house of cards topples down. Do you think it's that combined with racism? What's your kind of your view?
I think there's so many reasons and so many factors. I think a part of it too is that there's, I think, a reluctancy to be a bit introspective. And I think it's a lot easier to say, like, point and be like, oh, it happened over there. Doesn't happen here. And I think that that's just this innate, very unfortunate perspective that is kind of continually perpetrated. And I think a lot of it also has to do with advertising. I watch the news and, you're going to see a few commercials by, major fast food companies and major meat companies and things like that. And so I know to an extent that does play into it. there's always been a reluctancy, I think, for the media to also go after the animal agriculture industry. Let me put it this way. I have personally sent really brutal footage to a ton of media outlets, and especially when everything with this happened, to kind of say like, hey, like we're talking about, you're talking about what they call wet markets, but what, I like to refer to as a live animal market, simply because I think that they've made that term incredibly dangerous. Yeah. Here's some footage of one in the area that you cover. Like, this is like your local news channels, and I've reached out to all of them. Like, I filmed this 2 weeks ago. This happened here. This is something that's probably worth exploring, especially given the interest right now. And it's always crickets back.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Once in a while, there have been a few organizations here that have actually made some headway with the press. And this is the most surprising to me, is that TMZ. Mm-hmm. Do you have TMZ?
I'm aware of them.
Over there too, right? Okay, yeah. They have actually been surprisingly receptive to that footage. There are a few people here, I think some from the Save Movement and some from a group Slaughter Free NYC and some from a group New York Class. They actually reached out to TMZ, and TMZ actually reposted on their social media and their website footage from these markets, and saying like, they were shockingly, the celebrity news network, they were the ones that nobody was more shocked than I by this, but they were the ones that were actually the most receptive to it. And they were the ones that posted, footage from another group, I think out in California somewhere. And they posted from here in New York. And they, for some reason, seem to understand, like, okay, there's a worldwide pandemic caused from animal markets. What about the ones here? And so I'm continually surprised that TMZ, a celebrity news network, understood the importance of this, as to where I feel like most major news networks that, predominantly deal with worldwide news, let's call it, not necessarily like celebrity news, have been so shy to address it.
That is quite shocking, because my only recollection of TMZ, well, I feel like I should say TMZ, because that's, we would say Z, but, we say Z differently. So my only recollection of them is like covering Michael Jackson's death, that kind of stuff. So it is quite surprising that they want to entertain that.
Yeah, so I think that was a pleasant surprise for a lot of us in the community. Was like, okay, fantastic. Like I think that also shows too how, I think for me too, that also amplified how hard it is to get these major news networks to actually cover topics like this, because they were reluctant to, but you have TMZ that was open to doing it.
Yeah. In your experience, being outside of a live animal market, like you say, and you were experiencing hostility from the folks who work there and so on. And I kind of, I would have thought that would be expected. But I'm intrigued as to, these are, like you say, situated often in residential areas, in places where people are going to and from work, people are walking by, things are going on, it's part of a community. What's the reaction like that you've seen from those folks? Like, because I imagine, like, if no one's pointing it out, I could imagine a world in which it's kind of like wallpaper to people. They walk past it every day, so it's like, well, it is what it is, kind of thing. It's not like the one that was on the telly with the pandemic. It's a different one because it's here. That kind of mindset. But when somebody starts pointing something out, somebody stood there protesting, filming, being quite vocal, it I imagine starts to kind of jog the mindset of the people walking past, say, oh, hold on, is something odd going on here? What's happening? Have you experienced anything from the locals or local residents, etc., saying, what are you pointing out? Can we have a conversation about it? And any of that kind of interaction?
Yeah. So unfortunately, where these live markets and slaughterhouses are situated in residential areas, it's predominantly, and I hate to use this expression, but it's predominantly, like a lower income area.
Mm-hmm.
For example, I live on the South Shore of Staten Island. They would never let one go up here. And so so it starts off already by being an incredibly exploitative process, just alone from where they're situated.
Right.
So that's like a really also important factor is how, you're not going to find, they don't have a live market, on the Upper East Side, for example, here, but they'll put them in other residential areas. And it's kind of like, well, if it's safe enough to be there, then why won't you put one in these, posh zip codes? Like that, and so that's also a factor that plays into it. And for the most part, the residents are not happy that they're there. And again, I can't speak for all the residents, but most of the residents that we encounter I've had a lot of conversations and they've approached us and they've said, the smell is always horrible, or there's always blood in the streets, or I have to have my daughter walk the long way around because there is, blood, or there's, a dead chicken carcass on the sidewalk. And so I think that that's what's interesting too, is that for the most part, the residents aren't particularly thrilled because they're the ones that are actually experiencing the smell from it and the garbage dumps that are left outside. And they hear the screams and things of that nature. And so for the most part, the direct residents in those areas are very, welcoming almost to us. Yeah. Kind of like, we've spoken to a lot who are like, yeah, like this is awful. This is horrible. But then there are other times where we're at animal markets where they're so inconspicuously put into an area that people actually don't even realize that they're there sometimes. And then when we do tell them, they're like, what do you mean? Like, I live a block away. What do you mean? And then I'll be like, well, come around to the back with me. And I'll walk around to the back of the block and there's just blood everywhere. And they're just horrified because it's going into, I can't stress it enough how many times I've seen this get hosed into public city sewer systems. And just what a immense threat to public health this is. Even if you take the ethics, the animal ethics out of it. And so we've predominantly been met by people who, if they do know it's there, they don't love it for obvious reasons. And the ones who are the other markets that are a bit more inconspicuous, people are shocked in like a horrified way when we explain like, oh, like this is a full slaughterhouse and tannery. And then you kind of like walk a few feet with them and you show them a gelatin dump, like these massive, massive bins that they're just doing these constant dumps into. And they live 2 blocks away. And so they're usually shocked and horrified. And so I think more often than not, the people in the community are kind of receptive to us being there. Yeah. Again, not everyone. Some people who live in those areas are also patrons of these establishments. And so, but with that being said, I've never had a negative or a heated interaction with somebody who lived nearby them. Even if we do have, if they walk by me and they go in and they buy something and they leave, we don't try to get into an argument with them or anything like that. So for the most part, everyone's amenable to it. And if they do live there and they support that, that market as a patron, we kind of just allow them to go in and out without having an interaction.
I'm not surprised.
Because we don't want to alienate the neighborhood as well.
Yeah. No, I can completely understand. It's not surprising or not shocking to me, but it's kind of awful to hear, and it's kind of exactly what you'd expect, really. That, like you say, that there's almost a purposeful placement of these in areas where there is a lack of sort of socio-economic power, if you like, within the community, because they know that the people there won't have the social influence to be able to reject this, protest it, have the ear of their local council people, their senators, whoever it may be. They haven't got that. So it's I suppose more evidence of an oppressive system, not just from an animal welfare point of view, but on people with lower incomes. You could probably link this to education systems. It's kind of all systems. This sort of all systems of oppression linked kind of piece there, I think, is what I'm kind of hearing from that one example.
Yeah, and I also too, it's also very important when I talk about live markets, also to say, it's also very easy to demonize the people who work at these live markets and slaughterhouses. And I am very much somebody who tries to also be cognizant and aware of the fact that many of these people do not work there by choice. This is whatever their life situations are, this is the only job that they can get to provide for their family. And, animal agriculture also exploits people, and it does exploit the workers as well. And I think, and I understand kind of the gut reaction sometimes is to be like, well, who works there? Like, these people must be monsters, et cetera. And to kind of like want to yell at them when we get there and stuff like that and have these interactions with them. But, it's really important to kind of think like, okay, well, how did this person end up working here in the first place? Was this their first job? Did they think when they were younger that this is what they couldn't wait to do? Probably not. They could. There are some people who do enjoy this line of work, but some people are in situations where they cannot obtain other forms of employment and they have to feed themselves and their families. And so, the entire situation is complicated, to say the least. And so I always try when talking about going to live markets and slaughterhouses that a lot of the workers are also exploited, and oftentimes this is their only means of income. And so I try to develop as good of a rapport as possible as I can with the people who work there. Doesn't always work that way. I have had workers chase me with an electric cattle rod. I have, blood feces thrown at me. A lot of threats, like violent threats, sexual threats, things of that nature. But I've also had workers who have kind of expressed to me like, I don't want to be here. I have to be here. And there are, I won't say too much about him, but there was one worker in particular who, he's differently abled. And he expressed to me like, please don't think I'm a monster. Like nobody else will hire me. And so it's also important when kind of talking about live markets that, animals are exploited by animal agriculture. Humans are exploited by animal agriculture. The planet is exploited by animal agriculture. Animal agriculture just exploits everyone and everything. And so the hope, at least for me, is that there will be job opportunities created for people who do work at these live markets and slaughterhouses to get out of this line of work. Because it's easy to say like, they should quit and find anything else to do. But unfortunately for some of them, that other job opportunity doesn't exist.
Yeah, 100%. Again, the systems, the areas that these operations are placed in, there's a purpose to it. It's designed, whether slowly or quickly and deliberately, and it's designed.
Yeah, and so it's always interesting. Every time you go, it's a bit different. Like I've said, I've had workers who have been lovely to me while I'm there, as lovely as, the experience can be. And, people in the area who have been, grateful that we're there. But I've also been, like I said, chased with an electric cattle rod and, had customers come in and, curse at me under their breath and stuff like that. So it's a mixed, but like everything in life, there's a lot of dynamics, and other things that play into it.
100%.
And I think that especially for the, animal activism community, like moving forward, I just think it's so important to not leave the exploitation of workers out of the conversation. Especially like for somebody like me, I'm a very privileged white woman. And so for somebody like me to come in to these areas and demonize people who work there, that would be so out of touch and so, it's something that would be easy for somebody like me to say, but, you have to really look at the full situation and how so many other of these like socioeconomic factors play in.
Yeah, absolutely. You really do. And I think it would be easy for folks who want to get into activism to, like you say, to jump into it with all the sort of vim and vigor and excitement of I'm going to change the world here, and perhaps make some missteps in that and target the individuals who are ultimately also part of that same system, and don't necessarily want to be there themselves or be doing what they're doing. I think it's a really valid point you make, and sort of sage advice, I think, for anybody going into that world or thinking about it, which sort of actually leads me on to I'd like to get your perspective on this, and I'm just conscious of time, but I really appreciate your view on this. So I'm going to ask anyway. So there's obviously been, and it's fantastic, a huge rise in veganism over the last few years, perpetuated by some amazing kind of documentaries and social media and bits and pieces. There's lots of stuff, influencers and then things like this that have perhaps taken people on a bit of a journey towards veganism. And I'm thinking of whether it be that vegan influencer, chef or whatever, or that kind of Netflix documentary and all this kind of thing. And it's got a lot of people sort of on the bus, if you like. But I don't necessarily see lots of people on the activist bus. I see lots of people on the kind of, I've kind of done it now. I'm here, and I'm eating quinoa, and I put chia seeds on my porridge now. So, I've pretty much done it. We're going to save the world now, and as long as I repost the odd story, then great. Well, I'd just like to get your view on it, because I appreciate I came at that with a very biased, cynical sort of perspective in the question, but I would genuinely like to get your view on whether there's a goodness to that insofar as we need to normalise, we need to mainstream veganism, or do you think actually we need to be a little bit more aware that we're still just 1% of the world's population?
It's obviously tragically exciting to see more people posting and it becoming such a part of mainstream culture, because that will have a direct effect on how companies make decisions moving forward, and companies that get funded and topics of conversation, and all of that is, I'm thrilled, love to, over the moon about all of it. However, I think that everyone in particular has something that they're good at or something that they can bring to the table that they should also be doing in addition to, changing your diet. So if you see things like, okay, we're good.
That's okay.
So if you, you watch things like Seaspiracy, for example, and you see Seaspiracy and you realize like, okay, maybe you're finally done with seafood. Fingers crossed that the entire world is going to watch it and, act on what they see and make those daily changes in their lives. But I also think it would also be so much more impactful if everyone who decided to make the switch to being plant-based did something in their own lives that kind of just plays off of what they're good at. Like you said, chefs, and seeing more chefs post. And that's incredible. So if you're in the food space, utilize that platform to talk more about the benefits of plant-based eating and things of that nature. if you see things that you don't love, but you want to get involved in activism, but maybe you don't have the time. And a lot of people don't have the luxury of being able to take off of their job to go to a protest, or, maybe public situations like that, make them personally uncomfortable. There are so many different organizations that have online action alerts where you can, add on to protests, autofill emails to your local politicians, in support or opposition of, a new law that's coming up. Or, if you're really into fitness and that's kind of, your thing and that's your platform, also emphasize, the benefits of, plant-based eating when it comes to athletic performance, and encourage people to watch Game Changers as well. And so my cynical nature in me tells me, well, it's great that people want to stop eating it and, you repost something, but we need to do more. But the cautiously optimistic version of me is very much so hopes that in addition to making those daily changes in your lifestyle and your daily eating, that you will kind of capitalize on whatever your personal strength, your personal hobby, or, whatever else it is you do in life, and also incorporate it into that.
I love that. Bring a skill to the table, if you like, whatever that is,
Right, whatever that is. Everyone has, everyone has completely different things. Not everybody wants to go to a protest like me and scream, or go to a slaughterhouse. Some people are really great at, they're really interested in politics. And if you're interested in politics, there's so much that you can do right now without, working for government or things like that. Like, I'm involved with a group, Voters for Animal Rights, here in New York City. And I was a member of their voter election, their election team this year. And so we interviewed over 300 candidates who are running for city council and all of the things that we have, all the elections we have for 2021. And I didn't have to have, a background in law or politics to do it. You're approaching it as a constituent who wants to know where your local officials stand on, the pertinent matters that are going on in regards to animals in your area. I've learned so much just over the last year by listening and sitting in on the Zoom calls and learning and seeing how politics work, and a little bit more about how the legislative process works. And so I also think that sometimes people are a bit skeptical to get involved in a certain form of activism because they don't have a lot of experience in it. But I think things are so designed to be inclusive and to recruit as many people as possible now, that there's so many more opportunities for people to get involved in ways that they had never anticipated before.
Definitely. Absolutely. But Alex, it's been amazing chatting to you, and I definitely want to get as many of the links to places that you would recommend people start if they're interested in any of the things that you've talked about, and taking that next step. We'll definitely post all of those in the show notes. But thank you so much for your time. It's been awesome chatting with you.
I very much appreciate you having me. The podcast is incredible, and I really appreciate that you are showing how varied the world of veganism and, actually is.
Cool. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Cheers, and Alex. Until next time.
Bye. Have a lovely evening.